I first heard about him in high school during Veterans Day. They were like, oh, we're going to put up some stars and stuff in the cafeteria to, kind of just honor these men that died. And I was telling my mom about it, and she said, oh, well, you have a great uncle that was killed in the war. And I was like, what? I do?
Stories That Live in Us is a podcast that inspires you to form deep connections with your family, past, present, and future. I'm Krista Cowan, known online as the Barefoot Genealogist. I've spent my whole life discovering the power of family history, and I know that sharing the stories that live in you can change everything. Back in 2001, when September 11th happened, my brother was in the Air Force at the time. And almost immediately, he was deployed undisclosed, which meant for weeks, we had no idea where he was. And that little glimpse of just a few weeks of uncertainty was enough to give me a heart full of empathy for parents and family members who have lived for years without knowing what happened to their own military service men and women. My guest today is Tara Hall. She's a colleague of mine at Ancestry. And a while ago, she shared a World War II story about her grandfather's brother, Norman, and what happened to him. As we approach Memorial Day, I thought it was an appropriate time to share this story and maybe to give us all a moment to reflect on the lives of the servicemen and women who paid the ultimate price. Well, I'm so glad you're here to have this conversation. I would love to know a little bit more about how you got started in family history.
Yeah, so my mom would just kind of regale me with stories of her grandmother. She was born in Wales, and ever since then, I've just become obsessed with the country of Wales. It's amazing. And she would just tell me about all the stories of her growing up. And, right before I started college, she left Wales when she was about 19. And she decided to come to America by way of Canada for a year. And so it was just, it was thinking about how brave she was to leave her country by herself and go to a strange country where she had a few cousins, but, not very many. And so I was like, if she could do it, I can actually totally go to Idaho for college,
Right. Did you know your great-grandmother?
I didn't. I never met her,
Okay.
but
Did your mom know her?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
So your
very
mom
much
wasn't
so.
just passing on stories she had heard.
She knew her very well.
Okay.
And she became a nurse, and she married later in life. And, it was just, I could relate to her on so many levels. And that was what really got me started. And then I eventually, when I went up to college, I spent a lot of time in the library. I was not studying. I was in the Family History Center. And that first semester, I was hooked.
I love that.
Absolutely hooked.
I went to school in Rexburg.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I went to school in Rexburg too.
Fun.
And my first college job was working in that library.
Oh, that's so awesome.
Teaching people how to use the computers.
That's awesome.
That's so fun. Yeah, it was a good experience for me there. But
Yeah.
I had some of the same feelings, right?
Mm-hmm.
That whole leaving home for the first time. I was the oldest child. And so nobody had ever left home in my family before. So it was a kind of new experience for me. And yeah, you do think about there are people who've been doing this for centuries.
Yeah.
And they survived.
and
I'm here.
Yeah. And it's only a few states away. It's not like it was
Across an ocean.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah. And you're going to see your parents at Christmas, not
Exactly.
never again.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Did she ever see her parents again?
Her mother, she went and got her, they went over to, my grandmother was 3. My grandma, her daughter was 3. And they went on an ocean liner over to Wales, got her mom and brought her back. Her dad, she never saw again. Unfortunately, he passed away.
Then where did they end up settling?
In Salt Lake,
Okay.
like Murray area. So
Okay. And you knew your grandma?
Yeah, oh, yes.
Is she still alive?
She passed away in November of 22. So,
Okay.
yeah.
So it sounds like you've been surrounded by family stories growing up.
Yes.
And then when you went to college, you had this opportunity to dive into your own family history a little bit. Is there a particular story that captured your attention or your imagination that you were able to discover that wasn't kind of passed down?
That wasn't passed down. I just had this ancestor. It's not even a direct ancestor. So, but you know how names just kind of bug you sometimes and they come back to you. Like they'll, I just couldn't find anything on this guy. But Find a Grave, a little plug, Find a Grave really helped me kind of piece that story together because, with the 1890 census loss in Oklahoma, it was hard to piece together, but I eventually was able to find, and that was like my first success story.
Yeah, that one is always exciting because it's kind of the thing like you start putting the puzzle pieces together, and when it finally clicks, you're like, oh, I can do this. I really am like capable of doing this.
And,
that's awesome.
I made a lot of mistakes back then, but we were relying on CD-ROMs and floppy disks at that time.
Those were the days.
I know.
Yeah, I still remember the first time my parents gave me, I don't even remember which birthday it was. I could probably figure it out if I did the math, but they gave me the entire 1880 census on CD in like a giant CD case. And I was so excited. And my siblings were like, what? Why is this exciting? And I nerded out. And then I proceeded to spend endless sleepless nights just putting CD after CD into my CD-ROM to go through those names. I mean, I had lived through the days of microfilm, so I understood like the tedious nature of searching, but those switching of the CD-ROMs like that and having to wait for it to load and
those were the days.
You're right. So lovely that it is all now just available on Ancestry with a quick search.
Yes.
That's awesome. So you work at Ancestry now.
I do.
How long have you been there?
3.5 years.
Okay. And you're on the content team?
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about what you do.
So I believe it's the same team that you started out on.
Oh.
The QA, QC, and indexing team. I think back then they were separate, but we combined. But I'm a senior specialist for the indexing side, and I'm able to be in cool records all day and just look at the accuracy of our indexing partners. So
I love that.
It's amazing.
That is. That was my very first job at Ancestry for about 6 months, just reviewing the indexes and making sure they were done correctly by our keying partners.
Yeah. One of your previous guests, Suzanne Adams, she was the one that made me apply for this job. I was like, oh, I don't know. She's like, just do it, just apply. I was like, okay.
So as you look at records come through all day, every day as your job, is there any like record collection on Ancestry that you've been excited about?
I kind of nerd out about parish registers in the UK. Okay. Particularly Welsh parishes. I don't know. They're so fascinating, especially the poor law records in the UK.
Can you explain what those are?
So poor law records are the people that lived in parishes that were in need of assistance from the parish. A handful of my ancestors were actually in the poor law records. And so there'll be entries that say like, for Priscilla Williams, a coat or a blanket. Mm-hmm. And then there's an entry that says, basically, we're going to tear down the house that they lived in, or that they currently live in, so they have to leave. Mm. I'm not sure what happened about that, but it's really sad to read those entries, but it's also fascinating it adds just a whole new layer.
Yeah, and you think about the fact that that was their religious belief and their faith about the community taking care of the community, and that was just a record of how they did that.
Yeah. It's fascinating.
That's really cool. So when you think about the role of content, right? Parish poor law records, for me, it's census records all day, every day, right? Like every time a new census comes out, I'm so excited about it. I've been through 3 census releases of the U.S. Census. The most recent census Ancestry published was the 1921 England census. And to be able to go through those records, and particularly that 1921 England census is, I think, meaningful for me because of the fact that World War I had just ended and the 1918 influenza pandemic had just swept through the world. And you see a lot of women who are widowed and children who are orphaned or left with just a single mother, and kind of the whole shift in society after a war. And so I love census records because they show that particular aspect of this snapshot in time, and you realize what's happened since the 10 years previous. Mm-hmm. So I love that. Talking about, a world war, right? You have a particular ancestor or relative that is a story that you've shared with me and that I would love for you to share with everyone else, just because it's so moving when you think about the stories that come out of wartime, mm-hmm. and then how that has ripple effects for generations. So tell us about who this person is and maybe even when you first heard of this story.
Yes. So this is my great uncle, Norman.
Mom's side or dad's side?
My mom's side.
Okay.
Norman Harris. And he was my grandpa's brother. I first heard about him in high school during Veterans Day. They were like, oh, we're going to put up some stars and stuff in the cafeteria to, kind of just honor these men that died. And I was telling my mom about it, and she said, oh, well, you have a great uncle that was killed in the war. And I was like, what? I do?
And did you know your grandpa?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Yes, very much.
And he never talked about it?
Never talked about it. Yeah. There's so much regret not asking more and pushing in his later years, but I didn't know any better. Yeah. But I was like, okay, he was killed in the war. And, she was just telling me the stuff that she knew. And so he's always just kind of been this enigma.
Was there a point that you decided, oh, I want to learn more? Or
oh, yeah.
Did it just kind of come out over time?
It has come out over time. Most recently, like the last few years have been, and it was really with a release of a certain record set and a coworker saying, hey, you should check this out.
What was the record set?
So the first record set was the Missing Air Crew Report, and that is on Fold 3. And it just described what happened to him and what they thought happened and who died and all of that. So that was the first time that I saw like detailed descriptions of what was actually happening.
Yeah. So tell us about how he ended up in the military. I'd love to hear the whole story.
So he had 2 brothers and 3 sisters, and so big family of 6. And my great grandpa was very, very poor all of his life. And so he worked so hard. So he had several jobs at a time.
Here in Utah?
Yes. They were in Provo. They lived in Provo. His wife, my great grandmother, was born into, her father had gotten an inheritance from his brother. And he was a famous doctor in San Francisco, and he left the equivalent of over $1 million to his brother and his mother each. So it was a lot of money. And so she just grew up with so much, a lot of clothes and shoes and fancy things and, And
then she marries this poor man.
Yes. And so their relationship wasn't the best, but he would just work so hard, and he instilled that in his children. And so the 3 brothers, they all enlisted in the Army. Eugene Harris is the first son. He enlisted in the Air Force, or what was
Army Air Corps.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. He was really interested in flying, and I think Norman, the next brother, he really looked up to Gene, and he wanted to follow in his footsteps. And then my grandpa enlisted in the Navy. Okay.
And did they enlist before Pearl Harbor, after Pearl Harbor?
After.
Okay.
Maybe I'm not sure about Gene, but he might have been before.
Yeah.
Because I think there was a high school program that fed straight into, flying school, and then they needed.
Did they all join the Army Air Corps?
My grandpa joined the Navy.
Okay.
Yeah. So he's off in the Pacific while his brothers are in Europe, which breaks my heart sometimes, but just thinking about how alone he was.
Yeah.
So Norman joins the Air Corps and he goes down to Hondo to enlist in navigator school for planes. And so he was a navigator on a B-24. The B-24s were also known as flying coffins because they were so destructible. I think that just added a whole other level of stress for his parents and his family. But he eventually graduated from the navigator school. And it's so interesting because I didn't realize that being a navigator was so tied to astronomy until a few weeks ago. It was just crazy, but I never made a connection.
Yeah, now we think about like fancy instruments and all the mechanics of it,
but it was literally, I mean, the B-24s for navigation, where the navigator would sit, there's just a plexiglass dome so he can see the stars. And, there's a horizon that he looks at and then stars above him. And so he really had to know astronomy and be extremely, extremely smart in math, which is so not what that's not my strong suit. I love astronomy, but math is definitely not my strong suit. So he goes over to England. He's stationed in Tibenham and he is on his third bombing mission and he flies over to Dessau, Germany. They were trying to bomb one of the plane factories there. And his plane got hit by flak and it came down and hit another plane on the way down. And they both crashed. They were the only two planes lost in that fight. And it was only his third mission.
And so was he reported immediately? Was the whole crew reported dead? Was he reported missing?
So most of the people there were identified. He was not identified for 12 years. It took 12 years. So when the planes came down, there was a fear of the unexploded bombs that were on both planes. And so they couldn't get to it for a while. So he was presumed dead. And his parents both received telegrams. They were divorced at this point. They both received telegrams that he was missing. And, there's no other information that they were given until over the years, they got little tiny pieces and snippets of what might have happened until 12 years later, they finally identified his body. But
was there anyone that survived that particular mission that brought back stories or tried to communicate with the family? Or
no, there was one that survived for 3 days and he died in a prisoner of war hospital.
And no communication, I presume.
No. So the only things that we have are just eyewitness accounts. And so the people in Mosikau, I think is how you pronounce it. It's near Dessau. They saw the crash. They went and recovered the bodies and buried them in a mass grave. He, for some reason, was not able to be identified for 12 years. And over that 12 years, they were able to identify him by process of elimination.
Oh, okay. So they identified everybody else and he was who was left. Mm-hmm. Wow.
Yeah. And so on his shirt, he was a second lieutenant navigator. So he had the second lieutenant bars on his shirt collar. And there were only 2 men that had those bars. And they were able to, measure height and, just a few other factors that he was able to be identified by process of elimination.
Who was it that went in and did that identification? Was it a German organization? Was it a U.S. organization?
It was a U.S. organization. They came in after the war and helped.
So how was the family notified? How was the family notified when they finally identified him?
So he was presumed dead and declared dead a year after the accident happened. They just assumed that he was dead and didn't have any real information until 12 years later when they said, we think we've found your son. You have two options. We can ship him over to the US and bring him home, or we can put him in an American burying ground. And they said, we want him home. And so he was brought back over to the US, and his brother Gene accompanied the body from New York and all the way from New York to Utah.
Wow.
And full military honors service at this Provo City Cemetery. So,
that's amazing.
yeah.
So Gene and your grandfather both survived.
Yes.
So Norman is the only one who died in the family.
Mm-hmm.
And that, like, the fact that Gene and your grandfather had both served, they understood what that experience was like. But I imagine that there was probably some survivor's guilt with this brother who had, maybe even especially for Gene, who, because he had led the way as the oldest brother into that experience. And yet nobody ever talked about it.
Nobody talked about it until their later years.
Yeah.
And when they were writing their stories, Gene recorded a tape for his sister.
Oh.
And I transcribed that several years ago, but he starts talking about it and then the whole thing shuts off and he never goes back to it. And it's so sad to me.
Yeah.
I really think that his survivor's guilt for sure was definitely there.
He just couldn't talk about it.
No. And
he tried though.
Yeah, he did. I think, it's such a hard thing because in the later years, they do start or want to start talking about it, but they don't know how. And they think that, or this is just my assumption, for my grandpa at least, that like nobody wanted to talk about it. Mm. And so he didn't. But I think he wanted to. He just didn't know how to or who to talk to.
Yeah.
And the regret, like I said, I feel so bad that I wasn't able to talk to him about his brother and ask him, like, we don't know any details about his childhood, like what his personality was like. He's just always been this enigma for us. So he will continue to be an enigma until we see him again. So,
but you have learned part of his story.
Yes.
You've looked at the flight records. You've, listened to what Gene did talk about. Like, you've made an effort to kind of bring him back into the family story, the family narrative in a broader way. What does that look like? Like, how have you shared that information with other family members?
It's funny because his IDPF, so there's a record that all deceased people in World War II have, and it's called an IDPF, or Individual Deceased Personnel File. So my coworker said, hey, he died in the war. He will have this record. Now, unfortunately, they go from surnames A through N, I believe, because the rest of them are destroyed. But if you have...
But he's an H.
Yes, he's an H. So he had one. And I was able to order it, and anyone can order them through NARA. And there's just a wealth of information. Really hard stuff in there.
Like an autopsy file,
yeah,
almost. Yeah,
basically. Yeah. And he, so I found out some things that I probably wouldn't have wanted to know, but I have that file. But I'm so hesitant to share it with other members of my extended family, my immediate family. It feels so personal. It's almost sacred. It's an almost sacred thing. So that is the one thing that I haven't shared with my extended family. But I think really this podcast is going to just help me share with all of my other family members. And, we've been able to get in contact with a few of my mom's cousins, one of Gene's daughters. And so she shared a few things, and then one of his sister's daughters. And she actually transcribed, they had 7 or 8 letters from Norman to his sister. And it was so cute. They had such a cute relationship. There's one letter that he's like, now sis, don't tell anyone, but I'm starting to read poetry. And so, he's like, don't tell anyone. It's a secret. But I read poetry now.
Oh, so you do have some little glimpses into his personality.
Yeah, definitely.
So it's interesting because you think about like the way that he died and then the fact that the family didn't know what had where his body was for so long. And like that becomes kind of the all-consuming story of who Uncle Norman was. But really, you do have these glimpses of who he really was and the child he was and the brother he was. And that makes this whole story about a person. And so when you think about your Uncle Norman, like you don't have to think about the way he died as part of his story, but it's not the whole story.
Yeah. So his dad wrote a story about his life and
about Norman's life or about his own?
About his own life.
Okay.
And it's his response to finding out that Norman had been killed. And it really just encapsulates the whole thing for me. So I'd just like to read a little bit of that. He said, World War II had started and Arthur enlisted in the Navy. Arthur is my grandpa. Along with his close friend Tom. It wasn't long until Art was sent overseas on the destroyer Wedderburn into the Pacific area. All three boys were writing home often, telling me of their experiences, what they were doing, but not where they were located. I still have some of those letters, and I often get them out and read them over again, especially those from Norman where he says, "Don't worry about me, Dad. I'm going to be okay." I received a telegram from the War Department that my son Norman was reported missing. That was all. There was no explanation or further details. I was shocked, but I kept saying to myself, he is probably a prisoner of war. It was a long wait and a discouraging one before we were informed that he had been declared dead. Then we started to get a little information as to the conditions of how he was shot down. As this is being rewritten, it is 24 years since Norman left to go overseas, but the ache is still there, and I suppose it will stay as long as I live. I know.
That good for him, because men of his era often did not express those kinds of emotions.
Yeah. And I don't think he did outwardly, and I think it was just this outlet of writing his story down that was the one that he felt comfortable.
Sure. And then Norman's mom had her own reaction?
Yeah, so it was years later. It was probably in the 70s. My grandma went over to her house and just to check in on her, and she couldn't find her anywhere. And she eventually heard her crying. And so she kind of snuck in, my grandma, and checked on Norman's mom. And she saw her in a set of drawers that she kept Norman's clothes and his picture. And she was just weeping over that set of drawers, looking at his picture.
30 years later.
30 years later. And she never showed any emotion. You know, she was stoic all the way. And, but it was just this beautiful, to me, it's beautiful because it's showing that she is vulnerable and that she is a human being.
Yeah.
And it still hurts her.
Yeah. Yeah. My great-grandmother lost a child. He was a young father at the time, and she collapsed when she heard. So she had no problem showing emotion.
Yeah.
But my grandfather said to her, she was his mother-in-law, his words of comfort were no parent should ever have to bury a child. Mm-hmm. And yet it happens, and it has always happened.
Yeah.
But it makes it no less heartbreaking.
Yeah. I love that they are all together in the Provo-Sony Cemetery. He's with his sister and his parents.
Yeah. And so is there some way that you tell the whole story? And is that you?
I don't know. I know my brother is really also interested in learning more about him. And so hopefully the two of us can kind of piece things together. And, obviously my mom never met him. So including my mom in that as well. He always holds a special place in everyone's hearts in our family. You know, it's Uncle Norman.
Right.
And he was so handsome. Oh my goodness. The
We'll
most
have to
handsome.
share a picture of
yes.
him.
And you know, all of my grandpa and his brothers were just so handsome and so beautiful. But,
No. Is there anybody alive who knew him personally?
not anymore. No, they've all passed.
But you do have some clues.
Yes. And, you know, I was thinking last night, it really is, we have the edge pieces of the puzzle. Mm. We have the full outline of a puzzle, but not the meat inside and the puzzle pieces inside. So hopefully, you know, by all of these records that we've been able to get access to, hopefully we can be able to just take little pieces from each thing and put it together to hopefully create the whole puzzle.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah. Well, as you think about kind of your hope for the future, whether it's in telling more of Norman's story or learning more about your family history in general, what is it that you hope for the future?
I hope that our youth today, youth and teenagers, can look at all of the super, super hard things that our ancestors went through and look at that and say, okay, they went through something much harder than I am going through right now. I need to be more resilient and not let them down, you know? And so I hope that we can become more resilient through their stories.
Yeah. Well, you know what? You can speak to that probably with some authority because the story of your great-grandmother crossing an ocean gave you the courage to go away to school.
Yeah.
Right. And it feels like maybe the story of Uncle Norman gives you some additional resilience to continue to move forward in the world, which I think is a beautiful thing.
For sure. And, you know, we lost a nephew for me in our family, and he was less than 2 years old. He had cancer. And so we looked at all of the people that had lost children. I mean, it happened it happened all the time.
Yeah.
And we looked at all of those women that had lost their sons and daughters. And we were able to say, okay, we're not alone. We're able to, you know, we can take from their experience and become more resilient.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for being here. I'm glad I got to hear the whole story of Uncle Norman. Like I said, you've shared pieces of it with me. So now I feel like I know him a little bit better. And I'm excited to see how you continue to share that story with your family and what else you might find.
Thank you.